Hi, fifth grade. I wanted to just do a quick video with you to show you how to do some of the math problems in this next lesson because some of them can get a little tricky. So hopefully you can see my screen okay. I'm just going to use some Paint 3D to show you because I think that'll be easier than trying to hold up the board. But basically, I'm going to start with the first lesson, which should be pretty simple for you. We kind of covered it a little bit already. So I'm on page 506, and this is about understanding percent. And a percent is basically the same as a fraction or a decimal. We're just adding the percentage into there. Okay, so a percent is really just a fraction out of 100. So if you remember when we were doing our math minutes, I told you you can make a percentage by, let's say it's the decimal is 0.20. All you have to do to make the percentage is bring the decimal 2 places over. Okay, so let's say I want to know what percent 1/10 is. Okay, so that's my 1/10 as a fraction. 1/10 is a decimal. I just go over to my tenths place like this. Okay, to make the percent, I just move my decimal over 2 spots. Okay, because a percent is basically just telling you how many out of 100. So the percent for this one would be 10%. Okay, and of course, out of 10 or out of 100 is a little easier to do. It gets trickier when you get into, like, if you wanted to do 1/4. But of course, you all know how to make fractions into decimals now. So all you have to do is divide the top by the bottom. But hopefully by now you already have memorized that 1/4 as a decimal is 0.25 because it's the same as 1/4, which is 25 cents that we talked about before. Okay, so that's where it gets a little trickier. But to make it a percent, you still just bring it over 2 decimal spots. So that would be 25%. So these are all talking about the exact same number. It's just 3 different ways to write it. It depends on what exactly you're looking for. Okay, so all of these are showing you the same amount. They're all telling you, if I were to do this visually, woo, that's a funky looking box, I know. Okay, so if I were to do this visually and pretend these are all equal parts, here's a box and I shade 1/4 of it. Okay, that's 0.25 out of 100, out of the whole thing, and it's 25% of this box that is shaded. It's all the same portion, it's just 3 different ways to write it. Okay, and let me see if I can just erase all of this. And you guys are probably better with 3D paint than I am, so we'll see how this is going to work. I don't really like drawing on the computer, but it'll be easier than holding it up. Okay, so anyway, so for example, on your own problems, it says write the percent of each grid that is shaded. So all of your grids are in little pieces of 100. Okay, so basically you just have to see how many squares there are. And you don't have to count each individual square because each column is 10. So if you count by tens, you can figure out how many columns are shaded. So like in number 1, if you count the columns, or you can notice all of them is 100 and only one column is not shaded. So 100 minus 10 would be 90, right? So if it's 90/100ths, which looks like this in decimal form, 90/100ths, to make the percentage, just bring it over 2 spots. So it would be 90%. It's all telling us the same thing. 90/100ths in decimal form, 90%, and then in fraction, it would be 90/100, which is the same as 9/10, if we were to simplify it. Okay, so it's all meaning the same thing. Where it gets a little tricky is when you're in the single digits of percentages. Okay, so like number 2, there's only 4 squares shaded. Okay, so as the fraction would be 4 out of 100, which is easy in fraction form. When you get to the decimal, it would not be 0.4 because that would be 40 100ths, okay, or 4/10. So you have to put a 0 in the tenths place, and then your 4 goes in the hundredths place, okay? And I'm telling you these 3 ways of doing it because you're going to get into that shortly, okay? So then to make it a percentage, you bring 2 spots over, and it is 4%. But of course, when you're just working with the percentages, basically you count the squares and that's your percent. Okay, so number 1, it was 90 squares, 90%. Number 2, 4 squares, 4%. So with the boxes there, that's pretty easy. And the same with 7 through 11 there. It's all out of 100. As long as you have 100 on the bottom, your top number is what your percent is. So like on this, 90 out of 100, 90%. 4 out of 100, 4%. Number 7, 55 out of 100 is 55%. So it's pretty easy if they put 100 on the bottom to figure out the percent because it's just the number on the top. So that one's an easy one to figure out. Okay, so on most of those, it gives you out of 100. Then on 23 through 38, it tells you to change from the percent to a ratio, which is the same as a fraction, okay? And you can see on 12 through 16, they gave you a ratio. They just put it with a colon. It's the same as saying 91 100ths. It's the same thing, okay? It's just giving you yet another way to write it. Or if it says 35 parts out of 100, that's the same as saying 35 over 100 in a fraction form. It's just all these different ways of saying the same number. There's so many different ways to say it. Okay, so on number 23, 10% is the same as saying 10 out of 100. So remember I said the top number is what your percent is. So it's 10 out of 100. And then if I were to write it in simplest terms, I can just get rid of these zeros and it would be 1/10. Okay, so hopefully that first lesson is a pretty easy one to figure out. The next one is when you relate fractions, decimals, and percents, which is kind of what I've been showing you already. Okay, so here, let me just erase this. Okay, so lesson 2 is on page 508. And it's talking about relating fractions, decimals, and percents. And it gives you that 100 grid again to give you a visual example. So when you look at the example in step 1, it has 5 columns shaded. So that means it's 50 because there's 10 in each column. So it's 50 out of 100, which would be the same as 0.50, which is the same as 50 100ths. But if we were to simplify 50 100ths, remember I said with your fractions now, you're always going to have to write them in simplest terms. Okay, so if I simplify 50 out of 100, take off the zeros, it's 5/10, but it's still not simplified all the way because I can take them both divided by 5. So 5 divided by 5 is 1, 10 divided by 5 is 2. So in simplest terms, that fraction is 1/2. Okay, so that's the fraction form of it. Now, if I were doing the percentage, 50 out of 100 in decimal form, here's 50 hundredths in decimal form, right? Which is 0.5 because you don't have to have that extra 0. But if I bring my decimal place 2 points over, it is 50%. And some of these you'll be able to do in your head. Like most of you probably know that 1/2 of something is 50% of it, okay? It's the same thing. 100% is a whole, so half of something is 50%. Okay, so that one is the easier one to do. And like 1/4, I kind of showed you before, or 1/4. So if we think about the coin, a quarter, it's worth 25 out of 100. right? There's 100 cents in a dollar, and 25 cents is a quarter. So 25 out of 100. That's 1/4 or 1/4. So if I were to simplify this fraction right here, it would simplify down to 1/4 because I could take 25 divided by 25, which is 1, and 100 divided by 25 is 4. So 25 100ths in decimal is 0.25. Remember those place values. And then in percentage, you bring over 2 spots, 25%. And remember, if I didn't have anything next to the 2, say this was just 0.2, and I have to bring it over 2 spots, just put a 0 in there. So it'd be 20%. 0.2 is the same as 20%. Okay, so I'm going to go over the guided practice with you. So hopefully you can figure out the rest of it. So basically they give you a table, and you have to write the fraction form, the decimal form, and the percent. Okay, so the first one should be pretty easy. 1/10. That's your fraction. Decimal form, we don't have to really figure it out because it's already in a place value. 1/10 in decimal form is 0.1 because we have tenths place right here. And then as a percentage, we bring it over 2 spots. 1, 2. That makes it 10%. My writing gets bigger and bigger as we go along. Okay, and then so that's number 1 in the guided practice. Number 2, they give us the decimal form only. So 0.2. Okay, it's probably easiest to go from decimal to percent first. So I'll show you that first. So just bring it over 2 spots. There's nothing there. That means I have to add a 0. So that makes it 20%. Now all we have to figure out is that fraction form. So this decimal right here is 2/10, right? That's our place value. It's in the tenths place in your decimal, so it's 2/10. But is this our simplest form? No, it is not. I can divide both of them by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So the fraction form of it is 1/5, which is the same as 0.2 decimal, which is 20%. Okay? Number 3, they only give us the percentage on this one. So it's 65%. So like I said, the easiest is going from percent to decimal because the numbers pretty much just stay the same. So if I'm bringing it over this way to make it a percent, all I do is bring it back the other way to make a decimal. And a percentage is going to be less than 1 whole, so you're always going to have a 0 in front. Unless you have over 100%, then it would be more than a whole. Okay, so to bring it back to decimal, you bring it to the left 2, and it's 0.65. So your numbers are just staying the same, you're just moving the decimal place. Now we have to figure out our fraction. So decimal, this is 65 100ths, if you remember your decimal places. So 65 100ths. And this is, of course, not in simplest form. Okay, so I'm going to start with a 5. And we'll see where we go from there. So 65 divided by 5, 100 divided by 5. To simplify this. So 65 divided by 5. Let's see. 5 goes into 6 one time. 13 over 100 divided by 5 is 20. Okay, so 13/20ths, can we make that any simpler? No, we can't. So you can see that fraction was a little trickier to figure out, but you all know how to simplify your fractions by now. As long as you remember that place value in your decimal place, and then you simplify the fraction, it should be review for you. Okay. Okay, so just remember this is 65 100ths, whereas here we had 2 tenths. First place to the right is the tenths, second is the hundredths. Okay, so next, you just erase all this. There's probably a quick way to do this, isn't there? I just haven't figured it out yet. Okay, so this is really my first time using this 3D paint. So you guys are all experts at it, I'm sure by now. Okay, so next page is comparing fractions, decimals, and percents. Now this is the one where we get a little tricky. So the percentage part's pretty easy. The relating them, you can kind of figure that out, right? Because we've done all the decimals and fractions. Comparing them is where it gets the trickiest. Okay, so in order to compare them, the easiest thing to do is to make them all the same. Okay, so whether it's easier to make them all fractions, or you can make them all decimals, or you can make them all percentage. Personally, I like to make them all decimals because it's easier for me to see just looking at the place value. Okay, so I'm on page 511 and the guided practice number 1. And this is all stuff you guys know how to do now. It's just putting everything we've learned together. Okay, so we have 0.4, and then we have 1/2, and then we have 30%. Whoop, I can't draw very well. Okay, so you can see it's in 3 different forms. So the first thing I want to do is make them all the same form, whether it's decimal, fraction, or percent. And I like to make them all decimals, so it's very clear to see. So 0.4, I'm going to leave the same. 1/2, you should probably have it memorized by now. 1/2 is 0.5, right? But if you didn't have that memorized in your head, you could do 1 divided by 2 and figure that out. Okay, so 0.5, and then 30%, we just bring it 2 spots to the left. So this is 0.3. Okay, so now I have them all the same. They're all in the same place value too, so all I have to look at is 3, 4, and 5. Okay, and it says which is the greatest. So 5 is the greatest, which would mean 1/2 is the biggest. Okay, since they're all in the same place value. If one of them had a 1 in front, that would tell me immediately that that's the biggest one. Because if I have a regular fraction and a percentage, those are going to be less than 1. But most of them are probably not going to be more than 1. So as long as they're in the same place value, which they're all in the tens place, the biggest number in that place value is going to be your greatest number. Okay, then number 2, you have 1/5. You have 30%. And you have 0.25. Okay? So the same thing, I'm going to make them all decimals. So it's really clear for me to see which is the biggest. So I'm going to leave 0.25 the same. Okay, 30%, I just bring it 2 to the left, which would be 0.30 if you want to add another 0. Already I can tell this one is bigger than this one. But I'm going to go ahead and look what 1/5 is, which you may remember from the last page. So 1/5, I'm going to do 1 divided by 5. I have it memorized, but in case you don't, always remember the bottom number is the one on the outside here. Top number goes inside. So we can't do 1 divided by 5, so remember we have to add a decimal and a 0. So this is going to be a 0 on top, decimal place. 5 goes into 10 how many times? Twice. So that's 0.2. So which one's my biggest one? 0.2, 0.3, 0.25. The 0.3 is. So in this case, 30%. Okay. So it takes a little longer. And some of these you might be able to do mentally. Like this first one here, you could probably do that mentally. But in case it's something you can't do mentally, make them all the same form. Okay, and then number 3, we have 1/8. Whoa, does not look like an 8. 1/8, 0.2, and 40%. Now I can already tell just by looking at this what's going to be my biggest, because I know 1/8 is less than 1/5. Okay, so it's going to be less than 0.2. But just to test it out, let's take 1 divided by 8 to get our decimal. Okay, and it doesn't go in, so we put a 0 and a decimal place. Okay, make that a 10. 10 divided by 8, 8 goes in once. Okay, I can tell already this is less than 0.2. Whoops, I didn't mean to draw a line there. But I can tell 0.1 is less than 0.2, so I can stop right there. I don't even have to keep going. The only other thing I have to look at is what's my 40%. So I bring it 2 spots to the left. 40% is the same as 0.4. So what's my biggest one? 40%. So like I said, I could tell that just mentally by looking at it, because I know in my brain 40% is 0.4, which is bigger than 0.2. And I know that 1/8 is less than 1/5. So I knew that was going to be less than 0.2 also. But like I said, sometimes you just have to go through and do it to figure it out. There's got to be an easy way to just delete it all, right? I don't know. I'll just go back. I'll figure it out before the next time I do one of these. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. The number 4 is the trickiest one probably. And 2 of the numbers are in fractions. So I'll go ahead and show you that real quick here, just to give you some extra practice here. So number 4 is 9/20. 44%. And 3/8. Okay, so you can see none of these are in decimal form, but you can still turn them into decimal form if you want to. Or you can make them all fractions, but that is going to be a little more work, because if you want to compare fractions, you have to make the denominators the same. So if you were going to make these all fractions, it'd be 9/20, 44 100, and 3/8. Then you'd have to get your bottom all the same. So you would have to find your common denominator and make them all the same and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to stick with decimals just to keep it simple. Okay, so 9/20. I'm going to do 9 and 20. To me, decimal is just the simplest thing. Goes in 0 into 9, decimal place, 90. 20 goes into 90 4 times, which is 80. And for this one, I'm going to keep going because as you can see, it's 44%. So I'm going to need to go to see if it's any bigger. So 90 minus 80, 10. I'm going to have to put another 0. 100 divided by 20 is 5. So this is 0.45. This one is 0.44. Hopefully you can change a percent to a decimal pretty easily in your brain by now. And then I have to figure out 3/8. So 3 divided by 8. Okay. Goes in 0 times to 3. How many times does 30 divided by 8 would be 3 times. which is 24. So on this one, I could stop right now because I'm looking for the biggest one. And I can see it only goes in 3 times. If I did 4, it'd be 32, it'd be too much. So I can stop right there. I don't have to keep going because I'm only looking for the biggest number. So I have 0.45, 0.44, and 0.3. My biggest one is 0.45, which is 9/20. Okay, so that one, like I said, we had to do a little bit more math on that one, and you could do fractions, but I'm telling you it would take a lot longer than just dividing. Okay, so that's how you compare them. And sometimes it might tell you to put them in order. It's the same kind of thing. Just make them all decimals, and then it's really easy to see what order they should go in. Okay, so the next thing is lesson 4, finding 10% of a number. Okay, so finding 10% of a number is pretty easy to do, especially when you have a decimal. So don't let it freak you out when it says, oh no, how do I find 10% of this? And some of them are going to have 20%, which sounds even harder, but all you're doing is doubling it. Okay, so 10% of a number is just moving the decimal place one spot. Okay, so think about 1/10 is the same as 10%, and all that is moving your decimal place. So on number 1, your number is 75. Okay, and it says find 10% of 75. 10%, you just move it one spot. So your number would be 7.5. Just moving decimal place. Pretty easy. Number 2 is 19. 10% of it, move one spot to the left. 1.9. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Number 3, 3.8. So now this one already has a decimal, so it sounds trickier. All you have to do is move it one spot to the left. So 3.8, move to the left, one spot, 0.38 is all it is. You're keeping your numbers the same, just moving the decimal place. Okay? And then on number 4, you're trying to get tricky with your place value with some zeros. You have 0.4. Finding 10%, I'm just moving it one spot to the left. 0.04. Just have to watch your zeros. Okay, then on 5 through 8, it's talking about 20% of a number. Okay, so all you have to do is double whatever you did on 1 through 4, because 20% is double 10%. And this comes in really handy when you get older and start paying for dinner and have to tip your waitress. Okay, if you can find mentally what 20% of something is, you know what the tip is, so it's pretty easy to do. Okay, so here's 40. Okay, 10% of 40, I move one space to the left. So 10% is 4. What's double of 4? It's 8. So 20% of 40 is 8. Okay, number 6 is 120. And it sounds like a big number and it sounds intimidating, but when we move the decimal, move it to the left one spot to find 10%, that's 12. What's double of 12? 24. So 20% of it is 24. Okay, let me erase and get a little room up here. Now we're going to get some trickier numbers. But it's still going to be just finding the 10% and doubling it. Okay, this is what I do every time we go out to restaurants. Just find 10% and double it. Once you get it down, it's so easy to do. So number 7, you have 26. Okay, 10% of it is 2.6. So maybe you can't double 2.6 in your head, but you sure can write it over here. So you could take it times 2, or you could do 2.6 plus 2.6, whichever you prefer. the same thing. 6 plus 6 is 12. Carry the 1. 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. That decimal comes straight down. It's 5.2. Okay, and then one more, number 8 is 8.2. Okay, 10% of it, I bring it one over. So 10% is 0.82. And now I'm going to double that to make it 20%. So 0.82 plus 0.82. Okay, 2 plus 2 is 4. 8 plus 8, 16. Carry the 1. 1.64. Okay, so hopefully that is easy to understand. Finding the 10%, that's super easy. You just move it one spot to the left. And then the 20%, all you're doing is the same thing, and then you double it. Okay, last thing for this week is finding any percent of a number. Okay, so we did 10%, we did 20% of it. Now we're finding whatever percent we want to of a number. But it's not as complicated as it sounds. So remember when I told you anytime you see of, you multiply. Okay, so all you have to do, and it says solve by using a model, but if it's easier to just do the problem, just do the problem. You don't have to do a model. Okay, it gives you an example of how to do a model with a chart and everything on page 516. But to me, it's easier just to do the problem. Okay, so number 1 says 50% of 80. This one you can probably do mentally because 50% is half. So you can think in your head, what's half of 80? That's 40. So that's probably one you can do mentally, right? And number 2 is a little trickier though. 75% of 28. Of means multiply. Remember that. So 75%, the first thing I'm going to do is change it into a decimal. Now you know how to do that. 0.75 is the decimal form of 75%. Remember I said you just bring it over 2 spots to the left to go from percent to decimal. Of 28, that means multiply times 28. So basically all you're doing is multiplying decimals again, which you already did. 5 times 8 is 40. Carry the 4. 7 times 8 is 56, plus 4 is 60. Carry the 6. 0 times 8 is 0, plus 6 is 6. Add my 0. 5 times 2 is 10. Carry the 1. 7 times 2 is 14, plus 1 is 15. Carry the 1. 0 times 2 is 0, plus 1 is 1. 0, 0, 11. Carry the 1 and a 2. Then all I have to do is find my decimal place. 2 decimals here, so I bring it over 2 decimals in my answer. So my answer is 21. Okay. Then number 3, it says solve by writing the percent as a fraction. But yet again, if that part is confusing, just do the decimals. Okay, to me, the easiest thing is just multiplying decimals, because you all know how to do that already. But I will show you how to do this just in case. Okay, so 70% as a fraction is 70/100ths, which is the same as 7/10ths. Okay, of 90 means I'm multiplying times 90. So this one might be easier as a fraction. Actually, it's not. I don't know. It's up to you. Can I do my butterfly? 10 and 90 can be reduced to 1 and 9. So all it really is 7 times 9, which is 63. So if you want to multiply as fractions, that's fine. I will show you what it would look like if you did it as a decimal. 70% is 0.70 of 90 means times 90. And if you remember when we were multiplying with zeros, you ignore the zeros on the left, you add in the zeros on the right. Okay, so I'm just looking at 7 times 9. 7 times 9, 63. However many zeros are on the right, that's how many you add to your answer. And then I have to just do my decimal place. So I have 1, 2 decimal spots. So I bring it over 1, 2 decimal spots. I still get 63. Whichever way is easier for you, you can do. Okay? And then I'm just going to skip number 4 because it's the same kind of thing. 5% would be 5 100ths as a fraction if you wanted to do it that way, times 80 over 1, just like we did in the last problem. But I'm going to do number 5 real quick just to save us some time. And it says solve by writing the percent as a decimal, which is what I showed you in the first place. So 16% is 0.16, and we're just multiplying decimals. 0.16 times 40. Just remember of means times. Okay? And I'm going to go ahead and just add my 0 here and then ignore it the rest of the time. Okay, because remember I said zeros on the right, just keep them. 6 times 4, 24. Carry the 2. 4 times 1 is 4, plus 2 is 6. Okay, then all I have to do is look at my decimals. 1, 2 decimal places, 1, 2 decimal places. So my answer is 6.4. Okay, and then I'll do number 6 real quick. Like I said, it's pretty much just review of multiplying your decimals. Okay, number 6 is 80%, which is 0.80. Times 150. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put my 2 zeros in my answer so that I can ignore them the rest of the time. And just cross them out so I know I've already used them. 8 times 5 is 40. Carry the 4. 8 times 1 is 8, plus 4 is 12. Then I just have to look at my decimal place. I have 1, 2 decimal places. So I bring it over 1, 2 decimal places. There's my decimal. My answer is 120. Okay, so hopefully that makes it a little easier for all of you to understand. I know it seems tricky once you throw in percents with your fractions and your decimals, but it's pretty much all the same thing. And you can always let me know if you have any other questions.